There is a book that has been translated into over 700 languages, printed in billions of copies, and placed in hotel rooms, courtrooms, and homes across every continent on Earth. It has inspired great art, shaped entire civilizations, and been quoted by presidents, poets, and ordinary people in their most vulnerable moments. And yet, for all its reach, it remains one of the most misunderstood texts in human history. Why is that? How can something so widely read feel so difficult to truly grasp? That is the question we are sitting with today. This is not a debate. No one here is trying to convince you of a particular belief or challenge what you already hold. This is simply an invitation to explore, with curiosity and genuine respect, what this ancient collection of writings actually is, where it came from, and what it might truly be saying. Recognizing its true nature, layered, diverse, and deeply human, is the very first step toward genuine comprehension. What actually is the Bible? At its most basic level, the Bible is not a single book. It is a collection of texts, assembled across roughly 15 centuries, written by dozens of different authors in 3 distinct languages across wildly different cultures and historical periods. Think about that for a moment. The people who wrote these texts lived in ancient Mesopotamia, the deserts of Sinai, the hills of Judea, and the cities of the Roman Empire. They wrote in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. They were separated not just by geography, but by entire civilizations. Understanding this foundation changes everything. The Bible is not one book, it is a library. The Bible is divided into 2 major sections, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament, sometimes called the Hebrew Bible, contains writings that predate the life of Jesus and forms the foundation of Jewish scripture. The New Testament focuses on the life and teachings of Jesus and the early Christian communities that followed. But here is what many readers overlook. Within these 2 divisions exists an extraordinary range of literary genres. There is law, giving moral and social codes to ancient communities. There is history, recording the rise and fall of nations. There is poetry, raw and emotionally charged. There is prophecy, speaking into moments of crisis. It is the very thing that gives the text its extraordinary layered depth. The answer is both simple and extraordinary. The texts were composed over roughly 1,500 years, spanning from approximately 1500 BCE to the 1st century CE. That is an almost incomprehensible stretch of human history, and the people who wrote it were not a single group sitting in one room. They were kings like Solomon, shepherds like Amos, fishermen like Peter, scholars like Paul, and poets whose names we may never know. They lived in different lands, spoke different languages, and faced vastly different circumstances. It actually invites us to read it more carefully, with greater curiosity about what the original writers truly intended to communicate. Because most of us are not reading the original words at all. The Bible was written in 3 ancient languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Every version sitting on shelves today is a translation, and translation is never a perfectly neutral act. When scholars move words across languages and centuries, they make choices. Sometimes a single Hebrew word carries 4 or 5 layers of meaning that simply do not exist in English. The Greek word, often translated as love, for example, actually represents several distinct concepts in the original text. These are not mistakes made by translators. They are the natural limits of language itself. Understanding this does not weaken the Bible. A sentence lifted from its surrounding text can sound like a universal command when it was actually a specific response to a specific moment in history. Without it, even the most careful reader can walk away with a meaning the original writer never intended. Biblical context works on 3 levels. First, there is historical context, meaning the events, politics, and circumstances surrounding when a text was written. Second, there is cultural context, the customs, values, and social structures of the people involved. Third, there is literary context, understanding what comes before and after a particular passage within the text itself. Think of it this way. Imagine finding a single page torn from a letter written 2,000 years ago to a community you have never met. Without knowing who wrote it, who received it, or why, you could easily misread its entire purpose. This is precisely the challenge with isolated verses. Consider one of the most frequently quoted lines from the Bible, Jeremiah 29:11, where God declares plans to prosper and not harm, to give hope and a future. Inspiring words, certainly. But those words were written specifically to Jewish exiles in Babylon, people enduring a defined period of national suffering. The promise was communal, historical, and tied to a very particular moment in time. Another example is Philippians 4:13, often quoted as personal motivation for achievement. Read within its surrounding verses, Paul is actually speaking about contentment in poverty and hardship, not personal ambition or success. These are not small distinctions. When a verse is lifted from its original audience, its original crisis, and its original literary flow, the meaning shifts dramatically. This is not about dismissing these passages. It is about honoring them enough to understand what they were actually saying, to whom and why. Building on what we have explored about context, we now turn to another layer that shapes how the Bible communicates: symbolism. Ancient writers did not always intend their words to be taken at face value. They regularly used metaphor, allegory, and vivid symbolic imagery to express spiritual and moral truths that resisted simple, straightforward explanation. A dream in Scripture is rarely just a dream. A number is rarely just a number. These were intentional literary tools, deeply familiar to their original audiences. The challenge for modern readers is learning to recognize when a passage is meant symbolically and when it is meant as historical account. Treating symbolic language as literal fact can lead to confusion and misrepresentation. Equally, dismissing genuine historical narrative as pure allegory flattens the text in a different but equally misleading way. Both errors come from the same root: reading without awareness of how ancient writers actually worked and what they were genuinely trying to say. Taking our exploration of symbolism further, we arrive at one of the most misunderstood categories in all of biblical writing: apocalyptic literature. Books like Daniel and Revelation are filled with strange beasts, cosmic battles, numbered seals, and dramatic visions of collapsing skies. To modern readers, these images can feel like coded predictions about tomorrow's headlines. But that reading misses something essential. Apocalyptic writing was actually a well-established genre in the ancient world, widely recognized by its original audiences. Writers used this dramatic, symbolic style to address very real and immediate situations, often speaking about oppressive empires, political persecution, and spiritual resistance in a language that was deliberately layered and indirect. The beasts in Daniel, for example, represented specific historical kingdoms. The imagery in Revelation spoke directly to communities living under Roman rule. When we strip away the ancient context, we accidentally turn pastoral letters of courage into mysterious prophecies of future catastrophe. It is actually the beginning of something better, a more honest, more careful, and ultimately more rewarding way of engaging with the text. The honest answer is that it is simply part of being human. When we encounter any text, we bring ourselves to it. We bring our language, our assumptions, our fears, our hopes, and the unspoken rules of the world we grew up in. We cannot fully step outside of our own moment in time, and ancient texts ask us to do something genuinely difficult: to enter a world that no longer exists, and hear words spoken to people we have never met. This is not a failure of intelligence or sincerity. Many deeply thoughtful and devoted people have misread the Bible, not out of carelessness, but because reading across centuries is hard work. Recognizing this tendency in ourselves is not a reason for shame. The invitation, however, is to hold tradition with open hands, honoring its gifts while remaining willing to ask fresh questions. For centuries, religious traditions, denominations, and cultures have developed their own frameworks for understanding the text, and these frameworks carry enormous influence. A Catholic reader brings centuries of church teaching and sacred tradition to the page. A Baptist reader emphasizes personal scripture study and individual conscience. An Eastern Orthodox community reads through the lens of ancient liturgy and the early church fathers. Each tradition carries genuine wisdom, shaped by generations of devoted reflection. But tradition can also create boundaries. When a community reads scripture primarily through its own inherited lens, certain passages get amplified while others quietly fade. Interpretations passed down through generations can sometimes feel more authoritative than the text itself. Scholarship does not replace faith. It deepens understanding. Biblical scholarship is not about undermining faith. It is about illuminating the world behind the text so that modern readers can engage with it more honestly and more deeply. Fields like archaeology have uncovered ancient cities, artifacts, and documents that bring the biblical world to life. Linguists have studied the original Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek with extraordinary precision, recovering shades of meaning that translations sometimes flatten or lose entirely. Historians have mapped the political empires, social customs, and religious practices that shaped the lives of the people who wrote and first received these texts. Together, these disciplines help answer questions like, what did this word actually mean to its original audience? What crisis was this author responding to? What assumptions did ancient readers bring that modern readers simply do not share? With context and symbolism now in view, we turn to something deeper, the recurring themes that pulse through the Bible from beginning to end. Across both testaments, certain questions keep returning. What does it mean to be in relationship with the divine? What does justice look like in a broken world? How does compassion transform communities? What happens when humanity fails, and is restoration possible? These are not simply theological doctrines. They are human questions, wrestled with across centuries by people living through war, exile, grief, and hope. The theme of covenant appears again and again, the idea of a binding relationship between the human and the sacred, built not on perfection, but on faithfulness. Redemption surfaces repeatedly, not as a single event, but as a pattern woven through countless stories. Justice and compassion are not occasional concerns in the Bible. They are central, urgent, and persistent threads that refuse to stay quiet across every genre and generation. Within the New Testament, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, each offer a distinct portrait of Jesus, yet they converge on something remarkably consistent. The Gospel writers were not simply recording biography. They were communicating a vision of what it means to live with radical compassion and moral courage. At the center of Jesus' teachings lies a simple but demanding ethic. Love your neighbor, forgive without limit, and stand beside those society has pushed aside. The poor, the sick, the outcast, these were not footnotes in his ministry. They were the focus. What is striking is how often these teachings become secondary in modern religious conversations, overshadowed by theological arguments about doctrine and identity. Yet when we return to the actual words attributed to Jesus, we find a message that is less about institutional religion and more about how human beings treat one another every single day. They give language to experiences that often leave us speechless, and in doing so, they remind us we are never entirely alone. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Psalms and wisdom literature, texts like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. The Psalms are essentially ancient songs and prayers, and what makes them extraordinary is their honesty. They do not present polished spiritual performances. They cry out in anguish, celebrate with abandon, wrestle with doubt, and ache with longing. Psalm 22 opens with the haunting words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is not triumphant faith. This is a human soul in crisis. Ecclesiastes questions whether anything in life truly matters. Job demands answers from God in the face of unbearable suffering. These texts have endured because they reflect what every human being eventually feels. The text seems to suggest that the journey toward meaning was never meant to be a straight or certain road. Abraham, the father of faith, laughed at God's promises and lied to protect himself. Moses, the great liberator, argued with God and doubted his own calling. David, celebrated as a man after God's own heart, committed adultery and orchestrated murder. The disciples, chosen companions of Jesus, repeatedly misunderstood him, abandoned him, and denied knowing him entirely. These are not minor footnotes. They are central to the narrative. The Bible does not present a gallery of perfect spiritual champions. It presents a collection of deeply human beings wrestling with belief, failure, fear, and grace. Doubt is not treated as the opposite of faith, but as something that exists alongside it, sometimes within the same breath. And together they create the conditions for a reading that is neither naive nor closed, but genuinely alive. Do you read it with your intellect, or do you read it with faith? Many assume these two approaches are in conflict, that critical thinking somehow diminishes spiritual meaning, or that openness to faith requires abandoning honest inquiry. But that assumption itself may be one of the greatest obstacles to genuine understanding. Reading the Bible with intellectual honesty means asking real questions. Who wrote this? For whom? In what circumstances? It means sitting with uncertainty rather than forcing premature conclusions. Reading with spiritual openness means allowing the text to speak beyond its historical surface, to touch something deeper in the human experience. These two postures are not enemies, and in a world that often rushes past discomfort, there is something quietly powerful about a text that sits with the full weight of what it means to be human. Why does this ancient collection of texts still matter? The world has changed enormously since these words were first written. And yet the questions the Bible wrestles with have not aged at all. What does it mean to live a good life? How do we make sense of suffering? Where do we find hope when everything feels broken? What do we owe one another as human beings? These are not religious questions reserved for believers. They are human questions, urgent and unavoidable, felt just as deeply today as they were thousands of years ago. The Bible does not always offer easy answers, but it takes the question seriously. We began this journey with a single question. Why is the Bible so often misunderstood? And now, having traveled through centuries of authorship, across languages and cultures, through poetry and prophecy, symbol and story, we find ourselves with a clearer answer. Misunderstanding happens when we forget that context matters deeply. It happens when symbolic language is read as rigid fact, or when the diversity of voices within the text is flattened into a single uniform message. We have seen that the Bible was written by many hands across roughly 1,500 years, shaped by kings, shepherds, scholars, and fishermen. We have explored its central themes of covenant, redemption, justice, and compassion. These are not abstract ideas. They are living questions the text wrestles with honestly and courageously. Understanding the Bible more fully does not require abandoning faith or reason. It simply requires a willingness to listen more carefully. So here we are, at the end of this journey, and perhaps also at the beginning of a new one. The Bible has survived thousands of years, not because it offers easy answers, but because it keeps asking the right questions. Questions about suffering and hope, about justice and mercy, about who we are and what we owe one another. You do not need to approach it as a weapon to win arguments, a rule book to enforce behavior, or a relic sealed behind glass. You can approach it as a conversation, one that began long before you arrived and will continue long after. The most honest readers of ancient texts are rarely the most certain ones. They are the ones willing to sit with difficulty, to ask uncomfortable questions, and to remain genuinely open to being surprised. Wherever you are on your own journey, may you read with curiosity, with patience, and above all, with humility.